It was at times touchy, fractious, the curtain coming down on a G20 summit that featured finger-pointing and frayed nerves between Chinese hosts and some guests, most notably the U.S. delegation. Yes, it all ended on script, with the two largest polluters on the planet together signing the Paris climate change deal. But we're wondering, why all the tension? A sign of a stronger or a weaker China? More broadly, how's the G20 doing? A club founded at the height of the financial crisis, when banks and stock markets were free-falling while commodity prices were soaring. A club where political rivals are economic partners. Amid a blowback against globalization, we'll see how the statements have been carefully worded, and we'll ask what prospects going forward. Today in the France 24 debate, the Globalization Game. We'll be joined in a moment to talk about it by Jean-Joseph Boileau, economist who focuses on emerging nations. He's also the author of Economists for Dummies. Pierre Habart, senior policy advisor to the Trade Union Advisory Committee's delegation at the OECD. Welcome back, sir.
My pleasure.
From Brussels, Solange Chatelard, researcher on China-Africa relations at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Nice to see you. And Anastasia Nesvetalova, who teaches at City University of London. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. Yeah, there was no red carpet Saturday for Barack Obama. Rather, no staircase either for Air Force One when the U.S. president landed in the eastern Chinese city of Hangzhou. The U.S. press called it a deliberate snub, and points as well to a shouting match involving UN Ambassador Susan Rice. Cue, if you will, the tweet of the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency. Classy as always, China. Ironic there. Later, that tweet was deleted. Obama himself downplaying it all. Nonetheless, it was a surprisingly fractious start to that summit. How do you, let me begin with you, Anastasia. How do you explain that?
To be honest, I don't know. It must be something to do with cosmetic diplomacy, as they say, a gesture that would mean something more than just a gesture, but I have no intelligence on why it was constructed. It certainly seems to be carefully choreographed, but what the reasons are, I guess it reflects various tensions that have been happening between the two countries over the recent past.
Solange Chatelard, you have an idea on this?
No, I think I would agree with Anastasia on this. I don't have any direct intel on what was informing China's decision, but I do think there are strong indicators that this was a carefully choreographed event, as Anastasia said, that it's the Chinese, when they host events, and certainly large multilateral events like these, they take a lot of care and close attention to detail, and they would not really oversee something so important as the arrival of a head of state, particularly a US head of state. So we can almost be certain that it was deliberately orchestrated.
The Chinese press responding in kind this Monday, accusing the Americans of sensationalizing the spats. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, in fact, she also seemed a tad touchy when she was called on the matter by a Western reporter.
If Americans always call themselves number one, then why do they now lack confidence? The Chinese people have warmly received all the heads of state who are attending the G20 in Hangzhou. So why would we cause trouble for the US delegation on purpose? I think we actually have a close relationship with the American government. In fact, I invite you to ask relevant officials in the US delegation.
Pierre Habart, your thoughts on this?
Well, I guess I'll testify that the Chinese are very strict on protocol. I was in Beijing for the G20 employment in July. Like every G20 summit, what is important is to separate the last-minute issues or the conflict that may arise, particularly between the US and China. But in the past, you had Russia story, you have stories around Russia. With the outcome of the G20, this summit that is ending today is the outcome of a one-year process. Okay, and what is important is to look at the final communique, what all the G20 economies committed to, including the US and China.
Is it tension over the South China Sea? Is it tension over trade relations?
For sure, there is, I guess, some security-related issue. However, the G20 mandate is on growth. It is not on security. The G20 was created in 2008, 2009 as a response to the global economic crisis. And that's the initial mandate. How can G20 economies, including China and the US, coordinate their economic policy to at last get away from this low growth trap we are in? And that's where we should look at. That's the key issue that we should by which we would value assess the outcome of the G20 summit. But indeed, there's always interference. But the G20 is an economic forum. It's about growth and hopefully inclusive growth. And perhaps we can discuss this later on.
And is this a sign? I'll put this to you, Anastasia Nesvetilova. Is this a sign of a strong China or a weak China?
It's not really a black and white question. I think it's certainly a sign of a very economically powerful China, a regional power, a continental power, but we are quite far away from China being an aspiring world leader or even a hegemon. We don't really know what that vision would be. I doubt the Chinese know. And it's unclear how it fits into the existing institutional framework of global institutions, of global governance.
Far from being a hegemon, yet its neighbors don't see it that way.
Correct. It's not a contradiction. China is clearly a very powerful economic partner to its close neighbors, to the whole Eurasian continent, to many developing and emerging markets, to many developed markets, because this is where most of its exports are going. But I think we know from history that all, let's say, hegemonic adjustments or transitions, they were very painful and took a long time. And there are actually no signs that China is a very willing, aspiring hegemon. It's a brilliant tactical player that knows how to do business, how to transact transactions, how to seize an opportunity. But in terms of a strategic vision, I don't see it in any coherent or articulate shape as yet.
Not a hegemon. Solange Chatelaar, do you read it the same way?
I don't actually. I think although that China may not have a very clear and coherent plan at the moment, but I do certainly see it as having both a medium and a long-term vision. Domestically speaking, China has major readjustments to do towards its economy, and it's doing it at a very difficult time while it's integrating into the global economies in entirely unprecedented ways if you look at its economic history and its history of diplomatic engagement across the world. And I think China, where I would agree with Anastasia, is that it's certainly not a willing hegemonic power, but it'll ultimately become one despite itself, malgré lui, if you like. And I think that the leaders of China, both this generation and the future generation, are very much aware of that. And they want an innovation-led China. And they will leapfrog their way into certain very important key strategic positions, which will ultimately lay the ground, I would say, in the future decades for them to play, if not necessarily a hegemonic role, certainly a central role in the reshaping of global power relations in the near future. So maybe the word hegemon is what's slightly off-putting now, because we'll be entering an era where hegemonic powers may be configured in very different ways, where hegemonic governance will be will play out in very different ways. But China will certainly will play a fundamental role in restructuring, I would say, global power relations in the near future, and they're very, very much aware of that. And I think that certainly a group, or of course several competing groups of people, are discussing, debating, mapping out competing visions for China and the world in the future. And I think that's certainly underway. And saying that it's not happening would be big underestimation of what the Chinese are capable of.
The Chinese are capable of. However, there is an important domestic consideration. We're going to bring in Jean-Joseph Boileau. Paris traffic could not keep him away, economist. And we were talking about the spat, the outset of the G20 summit, and the role going forward of China as a hegemon or not, how much it will be its role on the world scene. Of course, a lot of it depends on China's relative strength domestically. And the question that everyone's asking is, with the economy slowing down, is it going to be a soft or hard landing?
Well, I was lucky enough to be late and to read the full statement for 45 items, etc., etc.
From the G20 communique.
G20 communique. But it's a very interesting communique, and surprised by 2 points. The first one, to answer your question, is largely, almost 100% come from China itself. The recommendation, the trajectory of growth, the so-called 4I, innovation, integrated, interconnected, etc., which means that the impetus of the influence of China has become very important, very important. You'll see more influence of China than US on that communique.
So they're not a reluctant hegemon anymore. They're out there pushing the agenda.
They are pushing. 60-70% of that communique come from China itself. I could read, a month ago, and word by word, this is almost the same. That's tremendous. Number two, I think that with this communique, with this agreement in Hangzhou, the capacity for China to manage this soft landing is much greater than what it could have been if that G20 could not achieve that consensus. That's my perception. So I bet and I buy the soft landing of China in the near term. Yeah. That's my vision.
Pierre Abard.
Yeah, two aspects. First, it's a G20 that was on the Chinese presidency, so it doesn't necessarily come as a surprise that China has its key priorities. One particular point. Why is I don't know if China is becoming more hegemonic than before. For sure, China finds more interest in playing the multilateral game than before. You can see it in their increased cooperation with international organizations such as the OECD, where in the past they wouldn't necessarily be that interested in cooperating with them. And so perhaps they find some interest.
But they've also done things like create their own Asian Development Bank, their own, but but sort of rivaling the World Bank.
That is why precisely one of the key outcomes of the G20 today is a renewed focus on infrastructure, and on building this global alliance on infrastructure to make sure that their own initiative, this Asian Development Bank, infrastructure bank, does cooperate, fit well in this multilateral game with the IMF and the World Bank.
All right. Even though China's set up that Asian Development Bank, the head of the World Bank, bearing no grudges, at least when he was interviewed by Chinese television, Yong Kim, full of praise for the hosts.
Took a very bold but critically important step when it declared that it was going to change the way that it was going to grow its economy. One focused on quantity to one focused on quality. They're going to be cutting steel production. They're going to be cutting coal mining. These are things that the entire world was looking for China to do, and to hear it coming from President Xi, I think was very reassuring.
Anastasia, your reaction to the words of the World Bank there?
I'm afraid the sound was a little bit muffled, but I can get the message. I think it's important not to confuse economic projects and business partnerships with a vision of a new institutional or a revised institutional order. Economy and business are part of capitalism, but capitalism is part of a global political order. What we have at the moment, it's a flawed architecture, but it is a working architecture. Centered on the Bretton Woods sisters, the United Nations, OECD, the G20, and the existing structures that were put in place largely after Second World War internationally, they very clearly reflect domestic political and economic order of the member states. It is based on the ideas of market competition, as watchful state, democracy and the rule of law. Infrastructure projects or resource-based deals or economic partnerships or even diplomacy doesn't build into that very coherent and articulate vision that would parallel or oppose existing political architecture of the liberal or the Western world. I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm not saying it works for all, but I'm just saying that very concrete, specific, and problem-solving approach that the Chinese have been employing so far.
All right, let me turn on that point.
Doesn't build into that vision.
Let me turn to that point to the trade unionist here. We heard there that the President of the World Bank saying, hey, the Chinese are going forth with cutting things like steel and coal production. Remember that dumping of steel is something that worries people here in Europe a lot,
including the labor movement.
Is that a correct statement?
It's an aspiration. If China, our reading of it, and we will hope that China will invest in the multilateral system, it's because it is itself facing a number of challenges. One is indeed, we know it, the climate change transition. It is the first polluter or CO2 emission. It's also a transition to a full market economy. Chinese state-owned enterprises represent a large chunk of the economy, and there are issues of governance, of transparency with them. But let me come back, because I think it's Jean-Joseph, but also Solange, who brought this important transition to what is called a new normal. China used to be run on a 10% GDP growth per year. Now they are shifting from an export economy to a more domestic consumer. And that does not come easily. Social unrest is on the rise. Just to give you an idea, strikes and protests have jumped 20% over the last 6 months compared to last year. Workers, households are unhappy with the benefits, with how the fruits of and the benefit of growth are being shared. So that's also a key challenge for China, how to build good social dialogue. And obviously labor rights, human rights is something that still remain a challenge for them. So they're on a transition, and hopefully they will play the multilateral system to meet those these transitions, social and environmental.
All right, when we come back in the France 24 debate, we're going to be looking at how the view, not just of China, but also the other 19 leaders in the room, is changing when it comes to globalization under the pressure of citizens who are worried about its effects. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.